The German officers gathered around the wooden table inside the dimly lit command room, the faint vibration of distant artillery echoing through the stone walls like the heartbeat of a restless continent. Maps were spread across the surface, creased, stained, and smudged by anxiety and sleepless hands. For weeks, they had relied on these maps to make sense of a war that was beginning to slip from their fingers. But today, a new report lay on top of them, a thin folder brought by courier from Berlin, stamped with urgency and sealed with a level of secrecy that made even the most experienced staff officers uneasy. Colonel Arndt von Bremer, who had seen the war evolve from lightning-fast breakthroughs to an exhausting struggle of attrition, opened the folder with the slow, deliberate tension of a man expecting to find something he wouldn't like. His gloved fingers pinched the first sheet and he stared silently at the numbers. The others watched him closely. A man like Arndt never reacted dramatically, not even under bombardment. But even he could not hide the tightening in his jaw. "This cannot be correct," he muttered in German, his voice deep but unsteady. Captain Weiss leaned forward, his spectacles glinting in the low light. "What do the Americans claim now?" Arndt did not respond immediately. Instead, he turned the page, then another, scanning each line as if searching for a mistake, an exaggeration, anything that could invalidate the information. But all he found were confirmations. Data compiled by intelligence analysts, reconnaissance flights, intercepted transmissions, and industrial evaluations, all pointing to the same unbelievable conclusion. Finally, he exhaled sharply. "They have outproduced us in tanks this month alone by a factor that defies reason." Another officer scoffed. "Impossible. We have increased Panther output. The factories in the east have been working day and night." Arndt placed the sheet on the table so everyone could see. On one side, neat columns listed German tank production, Panthers, Tigers, assault guns, numbers that had taken immense effort, manpower, and resources to achieve. On the other side were American numbers. They were not merely higher. They were overwhelming. Weiss felt his stomach twist. "This is not production. This is mass creation." "No wonder they don't stop coming," another whispered. Outside, the cold wind swept across the muddy ground of the command post. Trucks rumbled, boots stomped, radios crackled. But inside that room, for a moment, everything fell into silence. The kind of silence that wasn't peace, but resignation. For months, German troops at the front had expressed the same sentiment. The Americans seemed to replace every destroyed tank with two new ones. The rumor had become almost mythological, an exaggeration soldiers told each other around campfires or while repairing damaged vehicles. But now, looking at the official report, the officers understood the unsettling truth. Those stories were not exaggerations. They had been underestimations. Arndt swallowed. "This explains why our armored divisions can no longer recover. Even with tactical victories, the numbers erase them." He walked to the small window and stared at the dull sky. He had no admiration for the enemy, respect, maybe, but never admiration. Yet he could not deny what he was seeing, an industrial force operating at a scale the German war machine simply could not match. Factories across the American continent, untouched by bombers, powered by seemingly endless manpower and resources, were pushing out tanks like a river that refused to dry. And somewhere in the distance, the thunder of artillery reminded them that every new American tank was already on its way to the front. The officers gathered again around the table. Weiss cleared his throat. "If the Americans can sustain this pace, how long until they overwhelm every front? The West, the South, even Italy, it won't matter how skilled our crews are." Arndt did not turn from the window. "It already doesn't matter. This is a different kind of warfare now. Not decided by brilliant maneuvers, but by factories and fuel." A messenger entered abruptly, saluting with urgency. Her Oberst, a reconnaissance unit, brought additional footage from the Western Front. "You should see this." Arndt nodded. "Bring it." Minutes later, a projector hummed softly in the darkened room. Shadows trembled on the concrete wall. The grainy film flickered to life. A long convoy appeared, American tanks rolling across open terrain, their silhouettes unmistakable. Shermans, dozens of them. In tight columns, engines rumbling steadily, moving forward in perfect coordination. "It's like a parade," Weiss whispered. One of the younger officers clenched his fists. "They don't even hide. They advance as if nothing can stop them." The film continued. More tanks. More trucks. More supply vehicles. And then, something that made even Arndt's breath catch. A wide-angle shot, taken from the air, showing an American armored column stretching so far across the landscape that even the camera failed to capture the entire length. That must be hundreds, someone murmured. Weiss spoke in disbelief. That must be thousands. Arndt watched the screen, expression hardening. And they will build thousands more. When the film ended, no one moved to turn the lights on. The officers remained in the dimness, as if hoping the darkness might soften what they had just seen. But it didn't. The war was changing, and they all felt it. Arndt finally broke the silence. We cannot afford to waste tanks on frontal assaults anymore. Every loss is irreplaceable. Weiss nodded. But they can lose 10 and replace them tomorrow. Arndt closed his eyes briefly. He remembered the early days of the war, the sweeping advances, the exhilarating speed, the feeling that German engineering and leadership were unmatched. They had believed they could shape the continent. They had believed they could outthink, outmaneuver, and outfight any enemy. But no one had imagined this, a nation across the ocean producing war machines faster than they could be destroyed. We underestimated them, Arndt said quietly. We all did. Later that evening, he walked alone through the perimeter of the camp. Soldiers hurried past, some repairing radios, others unloading ammunition, others simply trying to warm their hands by makeshift fires. He watched them, these men who had been fighting for years, exhausted but still obeying every command with discipline. How could he tell them what he now knew? That their courage was no longer enough, that their skill, their sacrifice, their loyalty, all the things that had carried them through battles across continents, were now being swallowed by the sheer mass of American production? He reached a wooden bench near a row of tents and sat down, removing his gloves. His hands trembled slightly, perhaps from the cold, perhaps from what he had read. The camp buzzed around him, but his mind drifted inward. How could the Americans build so much, so fast? How could they send so many tanks, so many trucks, so many supplies, while his own army struggled to replace even modest losses? He thought of the German factories, impressive, yes, but battered by bombings, short on raw materials, short on fuel, short on manpower. Even when they worked at full capacity, they were producing a fraction of what the Americans could produce with ease. The imbalance was not just military. It was systemic. A difference of entire worlds. A young corporal approached him respectfully. Herr Oberst, dinner is being served. Arndt nodded, but he did not rise. Go ahead. I will join you shortly. The corporal hesitated before leaving. Perhaps he noticed the distant look in Arndt's eyes, or the fatigue etched across his features. But he said nothing. Arndt looked up at the sky again. Gray clouds drifted slowly, heavy and shapeless. Somewhere beyond them, far across oceans and continents, American factories lit the night with their ceaseless activity, stamping steel, welding armor plates, assembling engines. The image haunted him. A country that had turned its industrial might into a force so vast it seemed almost mechanical, unstoppable, like a giant awakening. He finally stood and walked back toward the command post. The war had not been lost yet, but something inside him understood that the fight had entered a new phase, one that Germany was not prepared for. And he knew that the numbers in that report were only the beginning. The next morning began with the familiar sound of engines coughing to life, boots marching in formation, and the metallic clatter of tools on armored hulls. A thin mist hung over the camp, turning every silhouette into a blurred shadow moving between tents and vehicles. Arndt von Bremer stepped out of his quarters with the same stiffness he had felt every morning for the past few months, an exhaustion that was no longer physical but deeply rooted in the growing awareness that the war was shifting in ways few had predicted. He made his way toward the maintenance yard, where several damaged Panthers sat lined up like wounded beasts awaiting surgery. Mechanics knelt beside them, welding plates, inspecting tracks, tightening bolts. The smell of fuel and oil clung to the cold air. Arndt observed quietly as a young sergeant struggled to remove a damaged sprocket, his hands trembling from fatigue or cold, or perhaps both. How long until this one is operational again? Arndt asked. The sergeant startled slightly, then straightened. Hard to say, Herr Oberst. We lack a replacement gear. It must be requested from the depot, but they're short too. Bombings disrupted the last shipment. Arndt nodded, though the answer frustrated him. The Panther was a formidable machine, superior in many aspects to the American Sherman. But it was complex, too complex, and every repair seemed to require specialized parts that were increasingly hard to come by. "How many Panthers do we have ready for action?" he asked. The sergeant hesitated. "3, sir. Perhaps 4 by tomorrow." Arndt felt a heaviness settle in his chest. 3 or 4 tanks would be expected to face entire columns of American armor, supported by endless streams of supplies and backed by an air force that seemed to dominate every stretch of sky. As he walked away from the yard, he spotted Captain Weiss reviewing logistics reports near a stack of crates. Weiss waved him over. "Herr Oberst, you should see the latest intelligence summary. It confirms what we saw yesterday, and more." Arndt felt a familiar tension behind his eyes. "Show me." Weiss handed him the document. It had been typed hastily, but the information was precise. Arndt read through it slowly, absorbing each line with a growing sense of disbelief. "American factories have increased tank production again," he said. "Yes," Weiss replied. "Not just tanks. Trucks, fuel trucks, repair vehicles, recovery vehicles, ammunition carriers. Their supply chain is expanding at a speed that makes logistics specialists in Berlin speechless." Arndt exhaled deeply. "We thought their previous numbers were their maximum capacity." Weiss nodded. "So did they. But they're still ramping up." Arndt stared at the ground, his mind racing. Germany had always prided itself on engineering excellence. Precision, innovation, craftsmanship, these were their strengths. But precision took time. Innovation demanded resources. And craftsmanship required stability. America, untouched by bombings and fueled by an endless reserve of manpower and raw materials, had turned production into a science of scale. Not perfect machines, but plentiful ones. Weiss leaned closer and lowered his voice. "Some officers are saying that in a few months, the Americans might be able to outproduce both us and our allies combined, even if we doubled our current output." Arndt did not respond. He didn't need to. He already knew it was true. A distant rumble of engines drew their attention. A column of German half-tracks approached the camp, carrying fresh troops from the front. Men with tired eyes and dirty uniforms disembarked, some limping, others supporting injured comrades. Arndt felt their exhaustion as if it were his own. These men had faced American forces firsthand. They would know better than anyone what the numbers on those reports meant in reality. One officer, Lieutenant Kessler, recognized Arndt and approached, saluting stiffly. "Kessler," Arndt said. "How was the situation at the front?" Kessler exhaled, his breath visible in the cold air. "Difficult, Herr Oberst. Very difficult." "What happened?" "We engaged an American armored division near the river line. Our first assault went well. We destroyed several Shermans, forced them to pull back. But within hours," he hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Within hours, they came back with more tanks than before. Twice as many." Weiss frowned. "Twice?" Kessler nodded. "At least. It felt like we were fighting a machine that simply replaced every piece we knocked down. Our division commander thought they had reserves nearby. But we captured a communication officer. He said those weren't reserves. Those were replacements. Same-day replacements." Weiss closed his eyes in disbelief. "Same day." Arndt studied Kessler's face. There was no exaggeration there. No dramatization. Only exhaustion, frustration, and something deeper, something bordering on despair. "What is the morale of your men?" Arndt asked quietly. Kessler lowered his voice. "They fight bravely, Herr Oberst. They always have. But many are asking how long they can keep fighting an enemy that never seems to run out of anything." Arndt nodded slowly. That was the heart of it. Bravery, skill, discipline, these things had carried German forces through the early years of the war, through campaigns that had shocked the world. But bravery could not stop a steady stream of tanks arriving from across the Atlantic. Skill could not replace a destroyed Panther. Discipline could not compensate for fuel shortages. He dismissed Kessler and walked back to the command post with Weiss. As they entered, another officer rushed toward them holding a radio transcript. "Herr Oberst. Berlin requests immediate analysis of American supply capabilities. They want updated projections." Arndt took the transcript and read it quickly. Berlin needed answers. But what could he tell them? That America seemed to have unlocked a level of industrial power that Germany could barely comprehend? That their factories produced tanks faster than Germany could destroy them? That the war, once fluid and unpredictable, was becoming a contest of overwhelming resources? Weiss watched him with concern. "What will you report?" Arndt sat at the table and placed the transcript beside him. "The truth," he said. "Even if they don't want to hear it." He began writing, each stroke of the pen heavy, deliberate, almost resigned. He detailed the intelligence findings, the production numbers, the repair capabilities, the transportation systems. He wrote about the American tendency to prioritize quantity over complexity, how it allowed them to deploy more equipment faster than any army in history. He wrote about the captured soldiers' testimonies, describing massive industrial plants working day and night, with workers rotating shifts so that machines never stopped for even a moment. He paused only once, when he reached a simple but devastating conclusion: Germany could not compete with that scale. Not as things stood. When he finished the report, he handed it to Weiss. The captain read it silently, his expression somber. "They won't like this," Weiss murmured. Arndt nodded. "But they need to face it." A sudden commotion outside interrupted their conversation. Shouts echoed across the camp, followed by the unmistakable roar of aircraft overhead. Arndt rushed outside with the others, looking up instinctively. 2 American fighters streaked across the gray sky, twin specks moving impossibly fast. Anti-aircraft guns fired sporadically, but the planes were gone as quickly as they had appeared. "They were scouting us," Weiss said. "They move so freely now." Arndt watched the sky long after the planes had disappeared. American air power was growing just as rapidly as their ground forces. New bombers, new fighters, new escort tactics each month brought something new, something stronger. And like their tanks, their planes seemed endless. He returned inside, feeling the weight of that brief encounter settle on him. How many more planes would appear tomorrow? How many the next day? How many would Germany have to endure? One of the younger officers approached cautiously. "Herr Oberst, do you believe we still have a chance to turn this?" Arndt looked at him for a long moment. The officer's eyes held the same mixture of hope and fear he had seen in the soldiers outside. He wished he could offer certainty, a confident plan, a strategy that would shift the balance again. Instead, he spoke with quiet honesty. "I believe we must fight with everything we have. But I also believe the Americans have awakened something far larger than we expected. And we must understand what that means." The officer nodded slowly and walked away. Later in the afternoon, Arndt gathered the staff for another meeting. The room felt heavier than before, as if the very air were thick with unspoken fears. A large map of the Western Front lay on the table, marked with lines and arrows that no longer carried the promise of decisive breakthroughs. "Our priority," Arndt began, "is to adapt. If we cannot match their numbers, we must maximize our mobility, our precision, our ability to strike strategically. We cannot allow ourselves to be drawn into direct engagements where they can bring their full strength." Weiss added, "We must target their supply lines, not their tanks." Another officer spoke bitterly. "Their supply lines are endless." Arndt did not dismiss the comment. He felt its truth. But he pressed on. "We cannot surrender to despair. If the Americans have numbers, we must make every one of our actions count. Every maneuver, every deployment, every defense." Weiss sighed. "And hope our factories survive the next wave of bombings." The room fell quiet again. As the meeting ended, Arndt lingered behind, staring at the map long after the others had left. He placed a hand on the table, feeling the rough paper under his palm, imagining the countless American tanks rolling across those same lines on the map. The sheer scale of what they were facing began to feel almost unreal. An army not of men alone, but of machines fueled by an industrial giant across the ocean. That night, as he walked alone under the pale moonlight, he heard the distant rumble of artillery once more. The sound carried with it a message he could no longer ignore: the old war was fading. A new war, vast, mechanical, unrelenting, had taken its place. And Germany was struggling to keep up. The next days unfolded with a rhythm that felt strangely suspended between urgency and inevitability. The war no longer moved with the unpredictable energy of its earlier years. Instead, it carried the heavy, grinding pace of a struggle defined by exhaustion, shortages, and the overwhelming presence of an enemy whose power seemed to grow with each sunrise. Reports arrived constantly: production estimates, troop movements, reconnaissance photographs, supply counts, and every new document seemed to reinforce a single, unspoken truth: the Americans were becoming an unstoppable force. Arndt von Bremer spent each morning walking through the camp, observing the faces of the men who placed their trust in him. He watched them repair vehicles with dwindling supplies, ration fuel with meticulous precision, and prepare for battles they knew would be fought under increasingly uneven conditions. Their resilience moved him, even as he wondered how much more they could endure. One morning, as the sun struggled to break through a sky thick with clouds, Arndt found himself standing beside a Panther tank that had been partially disassembled. Its turret lay open, exposing gears and hydraulics. A mechanic was elbow-deep in the machinery, his uniform smeared with grease, his brow dripping with sweat. "Problems with the elevation system?" Arndt asked. The mechanic pulled back, breathing heavily. "Yes, Herr Oberst. We need a replacement seal for the hydraulic pump. But we don't have any left. We're improvising with what we have, but it won't hold for long." Arndt nodded. Improvisation had become the norm. German engineering excellence, once their pride, now clashed with the reality of limited resources. Every repair seemed to highlight the growing gap between what they needed and what they had. A supply officer approached with a clipboard. "Herr Oberst, we've received word from division headquarters. Fuel deliveries have been cut again. They're prioritizing the Eastern Front." Arndt kept his composure. "How much can we operate with?" "Enough for 2 days of limited activity," the officer replied. "After that, mobility will be severely restricted." Arndt dismissed him with a nod, though inside he felt the walls closing in. Fuel was the lifeblood of mechanized warfare, and without it, even the most powerful tanks became little more than steel monuments waiting for enemy fire. The Americans, on the other hand, seemed to have fuel supplies so vast that they barely paused between offensives. As he walked away, he heard the distant hum of engines growing louder. He looked toward the horizon and saw a line of American bombers flying in formation, their silver bodies reflecting the faint sunlight. They traveled with an almost casual confidence, high above the reach of most German anti-aircraft guns. Their presence was a reminder of another imbalance. While Germany struggled to keep even a fraction of its factories operational, American bombers roamed the skies with increasing frequency and devastating precision. Later that day, Arndt convened another staff meeting. The air inside the command post was thick with tension. Maps covered the tables again, but this time, they were accompanied by large reconnaissance photographs, black and white images showing sprawling American supply depots, rows of vehicles, and rail lines carrying endless cargo. Weiss pointed to one of the photos. "This depot alone stores more trucks than we have in our entire division." Arndt studied the image. The trucks were lined up in perfect rows stretching far beyond the frame. Fuel trucks, cargo trucks, ambulances, repair vehicles, an entire logistical ecosystem, organized and abundant. "What about their tank reserves?" Arndt asked. Weiss shuffled through documents. "According to the latest estimates, they have enough Shermans in reserve to replace every tank in 3 armored divisions if necessary." Another officer laughed bitterly. 3 divisions? We barely have enough tanks to fill one." Arndt didn't respond. Instead, he moved to another photograph. It showed a massive American factory, smoke rising from its chimneys as workers and machines operated in synchronized chaos. "Imagine this," Weiss said softly, "operating day and night without interruption. No bombings. No shortages. No fuel crises." Arndt leaned closer to the image. Everything about the factory spoke of intensity, movement, energy, a nation throwing its entire weight behind a single mission. He imagined assembly lines churning out engines, armor plates, tracks, and weapons. Thousands of workers rotating shifts, teams coordinating logistics with precision, trains loading shipments that would be on the front lines within weeks. He straightened slowly, feeling the gravity of that realization. "We once believed that superior design would win wars," he murmured. Weiss looked at him. "Now it's quantity. Tempo. Scale." Arndt nodded. "And they have all 3. As the meeting continued, a communications officer burst into the room, pale and breathless. "Herr Oberst. New intercepts from the western sector." He handed Arndt the decoded messages. American units were preparing to launch another offensive. Not a probing attack, but a large-scale armored push supported by artillery and air power. The timing was precise. The coordination unmistakable. Everything about it radiated confidence. Arndt felt his pulse quicken as he read. They're striking again. Already. Weiss took the documents. Their units barely rest between operations. They don't need to, another officer said. They rotate fresh troops in while we're still trying to patch the same units back together. Arndt folded the message. Prepare contingency plans. We need to reposition our forces. And alert the Panther crews, they must be ready to move, even with limited fuel. The officers dispersed with a sense of urgency, but Arndt remained behind, staring at the maps. The American advance was not just a military move. It was a statement. A demonstration of relentless momentum. That afternoon, Arndt rode toward the front lines in a staff car accompanied by Weiss. The road was muddy from recent rain, lined with trees stripped bare by winter winds. As they approached a forward observation post, the distant booming of artillery grew louder, shaking the air in long, rolling waves. At the outpost, binoculars and rangefinders had been set up on a ridge overlooking a valley where American forces were massing. Arndt climbed onto the observation platform, and an officer handed him binoculars. Through the lenses, the scene came into sharp focus. American tanks crawled across the landscape, dozens of them. Their engines rumbled like approaching thunder. Infantry vehicles followed in tight formations. Trucks carrying ammunition and fuel formed long columns behind the armored spearhead. Everything moved with a steady rhythm, as if rehearsed 100 times. Weiss stood beside him, binoculars raised. They move like a machine, he murmured. Arndt didn't respond. He lowered the binoculars, rubbed his temples, then looked again, hoping the second view would somehow seem less overwhelming. It didn't. The tanks came in waves. Not scattered or hesitant, but organized into layered formations designed to absorb losses and keep advancing. For every Sherman in the first line, there seemed to be 3 more behind it. Arndt counted, then stopped. The numbers were too large. One German officer approached with a tight expression. Herr Oberst, they are advancing faster than we anticipated. Arndt handed him the binoculars. Tell me what you see. The officer raised them, paused, then exhaled sharply. More tanks than we can possibly stop. Weiss stepped closer. If we commit all our armor, we may hold them for a day. Maybe 2. Arndt nodded slowly. And then? Weiss lowered his binoculars. Then they will replace everything they lost. And we won't. A deep silence settled among them. Arndt continued watching until the first American artillery shells began falling, sending plumes of dirt into the air. Their accuracy was unsettling. Their numbers endless. Moments later, American aircraft swept overhead, dropping bombs with practiced precision. The officers on the ridge took cover as the sky roared with explosions. The noise was deafening, the ground trembling beneath their boots. Arndt ducked behind a sandbag wall, shielding his head as debris rained down around him. When the barrage finally eased, Arndt stood again, brushing dust from his coat. The valley below was scarred by fresh craters, some of the forward German positions smoking. Do they ever run out of ammunition? Weiss muttered. Arndt shook his head. Apparently not. As the American tanks continued their advance, Arndt realized the full magnitude of what he was witnessing. This was no longer merely a battlefield. It was a demonstration of industrial supremacy. Every shell fired, every tank rolling forward, every aircraft overhead, it all pointed to the same conclusion. The Americans possessed a war machine whose momentum could not easily be reversed. That night, back at the command post, Arndt removed his coat slowly, fatigue weighing down his shoulders. The fire in the stove did little to warm the cold inside him. Weiss entered, closing the door behind him with a soft thud. What we saw today, Weiss began. I know, Arndt replied. We can reposition, we can defend, we can counterattack, but their strength grows each day, Arndt finished. Weiss nodded. And ours diminishes. Arndt sat heavily at the table, his hands clasped together. This war is shifting into something we are not equipped to match. Then what do we do? Weiss asked. Arndt looked up, his expression steady but shadowed by doubt. We fight as long as we can. We adapt. We endure. But we must also understand something important. Weiss tilted his head. What is that? Arndt whispered, almost reluctantly, we may be witnessing the rise of a new kind of power, one built not on strategy or brilliance, but on sheer, overwhelming capability. Weiss remained silent for a long time, then finally said what both men had been thinking. And the Germans are not ready for it. Arndt nodded once, slowly. Not at all. The night that followed was thick with tension, a quiet broken only by distant artillery and the occasional rumble of engines moving under cover of darkness. Arndt von Bremer lay awake in his cot, staring at the canvas overhead. Sleep would not come. His mind kept replaying the image of the American armored waves rolling across the valley, an image too large, too imposing to ignore. It hung in his thoughts like a weight pressing on his chest. Just before dawn, a runner shook him awake. Herr Oberst, the Americans advanced again during the night. You are needed immediately. Arndt dressed quickly, splashing cold water on his face before stepping into the frigid morning air. A pale, washed-out light crept across the horizon. Frost coated the ground, crunching beneath his boots as he hurried to the main command tent. Inside, officers had already gathered around maps illuminated by lanterns. Weiss stood at the center, pointing to new markings drawn in red pencil. They pushed 2 kilometers past our forward line. Our units resisted, but the sheer number of tanks made it impossible to hold. Arndt studied the map closely. What's their estimated strength? More than yesterday, Weiss said with a weary sigh. At least another battalion of tanks arrived overnight. Arndt frowned. Already? They must have transported them continuously through the night. Weiss nodded. Trucks, trains, recovery vehicles, it all moves like a synchronized clock. Another officer added, and they're using mobile repair teams. We observed them fixing damaged Shermans right near the front. They're back in action within hours. Arndt felt a chill unrelated to the cold. We can't even transport damaged Panthers without risking losing them to airstrikes. The officer lowered his gaze. Our tow vehicles are too few. And fuel. Fuel. Always fuel. Every operational problem they faced seemed to branch from the same source. Without fuel, a modern army could not move, could not fight, could not retreat. America, with its seas of oil and massive refinery capacity, treated fuel as an infinite resource. Germany treated it like gold, rationing it drop by drop. Before Arndt could speak again, the ground trembled lightly. A distant boom echoed across the landscape, followed by another, closer this time. Officers exchanged tense glances. That's their artillery, Weiss said. They've begun the morning bombardment. No one needed convincing. The rhythm of the explosions grew steadier, heavier, resonating through their bones. Arndt moved outside, stepping into the biting air. In the distance, flashes lit the horizon as American shells struck German positions. Columns of smoke rose against the pale morning light. A communication soldier approached him with a newly decoded message. Herr Oberst, headquarters requests an update on the situation and expects recommendations for reinforcement. Arndt accepted the message but did not read it immediately. Instead, he looked out at the smoke rising from the front. He wondered how he could possibly explain what he had seen, that reinforcements alone would not solve the problem. This was not a battle of equal opponents. This was a collision between 2 entirely different worlds. Arndt finally opened the message and scanned it. Berlin still believed the situation could be salvaged with enough strategic repositioning. They still assumed that tactical expertise could offset material disadvantage. Arndt wished he could share that optimism. Weiss joined him outside. New reports say the Americans are preparing a secondary offensive further south. They're splitting their forces to pressure multiple fronts. Arndt clenched his jaw. Because they can. Weiss nodded grimly. And we can barely reinforce one. They returned inside, where officers were discussing defensive strategies. But no matter how they maneuvered their units, no matter how cleverly they planned, each scenario ended the same way, German forces eventually being overwhelmed by sheer American numbers. A frustrated officer slammed his fist onto the table. We're fighting a ghost we can't catch. Every time we destroy one tank, 3 more take its place. Another officer shouted back, then we target their supply lines. With what? We barely have enough fuel to keep the tanks we have moving. Arndt raised his hand, silencing them. Arguing won't solve this. We must assess what we can realistically achieve. A bitter silence followed. Arndt continued, his voice calm but heavy. We are no longer facing an enemy limited by distance or transport time. They have mastered the logistics of war. Their industrial machine is tied directly to their military operations. Weiss added, they are waging a war of exhaustion. They know their resources will outlast ours. Arndt nodded. And they are correct. The meeting ended shortly after, the officers dispersing to their posts with grim expressions. Arndt remained alone in the tent, staring at the maps. His gaze drifted over the rivers, forests, towns, and roads, terrain that once seemed conquerable, now smothered under the weight of an enemy whose reach grew longer with every passing day. By midday, the American assault intensified. Tanks rolled through the valley with crushing determination. Arndt left the command post to observe the battle from a nearby ridge. The sound was deafening, artillery thundering, engines roaring, machine guns rattling in relentless bursts. Through his binoculars, Arndt saw a German anti-tank crew fire a shot that struck a Sherman side. The tank burst into flames, but before the crew could celebrate, 2 more Shermans appeared from behind a hill, their cannons blazing. Smoke and fire consumed the German position. Arndt lowered the binoculars, swallowing hard. It's like watching an ocean swallow a shore, Weiss said, stepping beside him. Arndt didn't answer. The comparison was too accurate. Near the front, a formation of American infantry advanced behind the tanks. Their movement was steady, disciplined, protected by armor and supported by air power. An American fighter swooped overhead, strafing a German troop column attempting to reposition. Where is our air support? Weiss muttered. Arndt shook his head. Grounded. Fuel shortages, engine failures, bomb damage to the airfield, even the planes that still fly are outnumbered 10-1. As the Americans continued to advance, a German radio operator called in from the forward line. His voice was ragged with static and desperation. They're everywhere, more tanks, more trucks, we can't. The transmission cut abruptly. Weiss looked down, jaw tight. They're collapsing. We expected this, Arndt said. What we didn't expect was how quickly it would happen. He knew what came next, a retreat. Not an organized, strategic withdrawal, but a scramble to survive under unbearable pressure. German forces would fall back, regroup, try to stabilize the line, only for the Americans to push again with new units, fresh supplies, renewed momentum. The cycle was becoming predictable. Later in the afternoon, Arndt visited the field hospital. Tents stretched across the muddy ground, nurses and orderlies rushing between wounded soldiers. The air carried the metallic smell of blood and the harsh sting of antiseptic. Men groaned softly, some missing limbs, others wrapped in bandages stained through. A young wounded corporal recognized Arndt and attempted to sit up. Herr Oberst, did we stop them? Arndt placed a hand on his shoulder. You fought bravely. But the enemy is strong. The corporal managed a faint smile. They always have more, always more. His voice trailed off as exhaustion overtook him. Arndt stood there for a long moment, unable to speak. He felt Weiss watching him from a distance, but neither man said anything. The truth was written in every wounded soldier's face. They were fighting a war that was no longer balanced. That evening, back at the command post, Arndt reviewed the latest updates. The Americans had established a firm foothold in the valley. Their logistics units had already begun moving forward, setting up temporary depots. They were preparing to push even deeper. Weiss entered quietly. A new convoy was spotted on the western roads. Dozens of trucks, more tanks, fuel carriers, ammunition. Arndt didn't look up. How soon will they reach the front? By tonight. Arndt closed his eyes briefly. The Americans were not just advancing. They were accelerating. Weiss sat across from him, removing his cap. Arndt, tell me honestly. Do we have any chance at all now? Arndt opened his eyes and met Weiss's gaze. For a moment, he considered softening the truth. But he had grown tired of illusions. We can delay them, he said. We can make them pay for every kilometer. We can force them to adjust their plans. But we cannot match their strength. Weiss swallowed hard. Then what happens? Arndt leaned back, the lantern light casting long shadows across his face. Then we witness something Europe has not yet fully understood, a nation capable of turning industrial power into military dominance at a scale never seen before. Weiss exhaled slowly. And we are the ones standing in its path. Arndt nodded once. Yes. Outside, American artillery resumed its bombardment. Each blast shook the ground, each explosion a reminder that the enemy's advance was not driven by bold gambles or desperation but by a system organized, calculated, unstoppable. Arndt folded his hands, his resolve steadying even as his hope diminished. "We fight," he said quietly. "Not because we can win, but because our men deserve nothing less." Weiss bowed his head. "Then we fight." And as the night deepened, the relentless rhythm of American firepower continued, a distant thunder that promised no silence. By the next morning, the atmosphere in the camp had shifted from tension to something quieter, heavier, an awareness that they were standing at the edge of something irreversible. The American offensive had not paused during the night. It never did. Reports continued to arrive in a steady stream, each one describing a deeper penetration, a larger buildup, a faster advance. It was not just the fighting that wore the Germans down, it was the realization that the enemy's momentum seemed immune to exhaustion. Arndt von Bremer moved through the camp as the sun rose, though the sunlight did little to warm the bitter air. Soldiers packed equipment, tightened straps on rifles, checked engines, loaded ammunition. There was no panic. Only resignation shaped by discipline. They were preparing to reposition once more, falling back to another line that would buy them only a few days, maybe hours, of stability. Weiss stood by a half-track, reading a new dispatch. His expression was grim. "What news now?" Arndt asked. Weiss handed him the paper. "The Americans have established a new supply hub behind their forward units. Fuel, ammunition, spare parts, it's enormous. They're preparing another surge." Arndt skimmed the document. The scale of the American operation was almost absurd. Supply depots the size of small towns. Repair stations staffed with hundreds of mechanics. Medical units equipped with resources German doctors could only dream of. The Americans were not merely advancing, they were building an entire infrastructure as they moved, a living machine that followed them like a shadow. Arndt lowered the paper. "They fight with the weight of a continent behind them." Weiss nodded. "And we fight with whatever we can scrape together." The two men stood quietly for a moment, listening to the steady rumble of American artillery in the distance. It had become a kind of background noise, a constant reminder that the enemy's strength was not diminishing. A young lieutenant approached them. His face was pale, his uniform stained with mud and soot. "Herr Oberst," he said, saluting. "Our left flank is collapsing faster than expected. They're requesting immediate reinforcements." Arndt glanced toward the west, as if he could see the unfolding disaster through the hills. "How many units can we spare?" "Very few," Weiss answered softly. "We shift men from the center, and the center collapses. We shift from the right collapses." Arndt nodded. It was a problem with no solution. "Send what we can," he said finally. "Even a small reinforcement may buy them time." The lieutenant saluted again and hurried off. Arndt looked at Weiss. "We are no longer directing a battle. We are simply slowing an avalanche." Weiss sighed. "An avalanche made of steel, fuel, and endless factories." Arndt did not respond. He simply turned and began walking toward the front lines. Weiss followed. They reached an elevated ridge where German observers had set up positions behind sandbags and camouflage netting. The valley below stretched out like an open wound, smoke rising from shell craters, trenches torn apart by explosions, charred wrecks of vehicles dotting the landscape. American tanks continued to advance, their silhouettes growing larger as they pushed forward in steady, crushing formations. Arndt raised his binoculars. The sight was devastating. Shermans rolled across the field in rows, some already firing their cannons. Behind them came tank destroyers, armored infantry carriers, trucks loaded with supplies, and mobile artillery. It was like watching a living creature made of metal, growing larger with every passing hour. Weiss whispered, "There must be, 100 tanks?" Arndt lowered the binoculars. "More." A German anti-tank gun fired from a hidden position, striking a Sherman squarely. The tank erupted in flames. For a brief moment, a spark of triumph flickered among the German observers. But then, 2 more Shermans moved forward to replace the one destroyed. Then 3 more behind them. Weiss clenched his jaw. "It's endless." Arndt nodded. "This is the power of scale. We were never prepared for this." Moments later, American aircraft roared overhead. Bombs dropped in precise intervals, shaking the ridge with thunderous impact. German positions exploded in fire and debris. Soldiers dove for cover as dirt rained down on them. When the barrage ended, Arndt stood again and scanned the valley. The Americans had already covered the distance lost during the bombardment. Their infantry advanced confidently behind the tanks, protected and reinforced with every step. A radio operator approached, breathless. "Herr Oberst, division headquarters wants to know if we can hold the line until dusk." Arndt almost laughed. Not out of amusement, but from the absurdity of the question. "Tell them we will hold as long as humanly possible," he said, "but no longer." As the operator ran back toward the communications post, Weiss spoke quietly. "They don't understand the scale of what we're facing." Arndt crossed his arms. "No report, no photo, no description can truly capture it. You must stand here and see it with your own eyes." The two men continued observing until an orderly arrived to escort them back to the command tent. The situation was worsening. German units were beginning to retreat in disorganized clusters. Ammunition was running low. Fuel reserves had dwindled to the point where tanks were being abandoned simply because they could not move. Back at the command post, the atmosphere was frantic. Officers rushed between tables, shouting coordinates, relaying distress calls, marking new enemy positions. The tent shook with every American shell that landed nearby. "We're losing the valley," one officer said as Arndt entered. "If the Americans break through completely, they'll have open ground all the way to the river line." Arndt studied the map. "Order all units east of the ridge to fall back to secondary positions. And send scouts to identify defensible terrain beyond the river." Weiss looked at him sharply. "We're preparing for another retreat?" Arndt's voice was steady but tired. "We are preparing for survival." Another explosion rocked the camp, knocking items off shelves. Dirt sprinkled down from the tent roof. A lantern swayed back and forth, casting erratic shadows on the walls. Arndt grabbed the edge of the table to steady himself. "We must move the command post. We're too close to the front." No one disagreed. The ground trembled again as American artillery intensified. Officers began gathering documents, equipment, weapons. Arndt directed them calmly, though his own pulse raced. Outside, vehicles revved their engines, some reluctantly, sputtering due to low fuel. Soldiers scrambled to load crates, weapons, and wounded men. The sky darkened with smoke as fires burned across the horizon. Weiss climbed into a vehicle beside Arndt. "We can't keep doing this," he said, his voice barely audible over the chaos. Arndt stared straight ahead. "We must. Until we can't." The convoy moved out, weaving through muddy roads as American shells continued to fall. They passed abandoned equipment, wrecked vehicles, and scattered units retreating on foot. The sounds of battle grew louder behind them, then gradually faded as they put distance between themselves and the collapsing front. Hours later, after relocating the command post to a wooded area near the river, Arndt gathered his staff once more. They set up lanterns, unfolded maps, reconnected radios. But everyone knew the truth, they were merely delaying the inevitable. Weiss approached Arndt as he studied the latest reports. "Sooner or later," Weiss said softly, "this will break." Arndt closed his eyes for a brief moment. "It already has. The rest is just timing." Weiss hesitated. "If Berlin understood this fully—" Arndt cut him off gently. "Berlin still believes this war is a contest of will. But we have now seen what they cannot, or will not, see. This war has become a contest of capacity." He looked up, locking eyes with Weiss. "And the Americans have capacity beyond anything Europe has ever faced." Silence settled between them, heavy but honest. Arndt slowly folded the latest map, placing it aside. His expression was calm, not defeated, but accepting. "We will continue to fight," he said. "Not because we believe we can win, but because our men deserve leadership, discipline, and every hour we can give them." Weiss nodded. "Then we stand with them." Arndt stepped outside the tent, looking toward the distant glow of fires on the horizon. The night was cold and still, but the world felt as if it were shifting, tilting toward a new future shaped by forces larger than individual soldiers, larger even than nations. He thought of the American tanks rolling endlessly, the factories that never slept, the convoys stretching across continents, the bombers crossing oceans. A vast machine awakened and unstoppable. Beside him, Weiss whispered, "So this is what it feels like, when history changes direction." Arndt watched the faint flashes in the distance and answered quietly. Yes. And we are witnessing it from the wrong side. The wind blew softly through the trees, carrying with it the distant echo of engines and artillery, reminders of the unstoppable force moving toward them. Arndt stood tall, shoulders squared, the weight of reality steady in his chest. Tomorrow, they would fight again. Not because victory was possible, but because honor demanded nothing less.